Welcome back, Deep Divers. If you're enjoying these journeys into, well, the depths of knowledge, make sure you've hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, and click that bell icon so you never miss a deep dive. Today, we're tackling a topic that's not just for those prepping for the UPSC exams, really for anyone who wants to grasp the levers of global power, the G7.
Ah, the G7. It might sound like just another acronym, but this group is anything but dry. Imagine a room with the leaders of the world's most powerful economies, making decisions that ripple across the globe. That's the G7 in a nutshell.
Exactly. And it's not just about understanding who's in this exclusive club, but how they got there, what they actually do, and what their role is in a world that's constantly shifting.
It's a fascinating journey, actually. The G7 didn't start with some grand declaration or a rule book. It was 1975. The oil crisis was sending shockwaves through the global economy, and the leaders of France and Germany, Valéry Giscard d'Estaing and Helmut Schmidt, thought, hey, let's get some friends together and talk this out.
So it's like a casual brainstorming session with the most powerful people on the planet.
Pretty much. They invited leaders from the US, Britain, Italy, and Japan to the Château de Rambouillet in France. No strict rules, no permanent office, just a very high-stakes chat over, I'm guessing, some incredibly fancy coffee.
Château de Rambouillet. It definitely sounds more like a luxurious retreat than a hardcore economic summit. But I guess when you're shaping global economic policy, you might as well do it in style.
Exactly. And a year later, Canada decided to join the party in Puerto Rico. And just like that, the G7 was officially born. These informality, this lack of rigid structure, is actually a key characteristic of the G7. It's an exclusive club, for sure, but one that's always operated more on consensus and shared interests than on hard and fast rules.
So they're not bound by any treaty or constitution.
Not in the traditional sense. There's no G7 charter or secretariat. The presidency rotates annually among members, and that country gets to set the agenda for the year. It's a very dynamic and flexible setup, which can be both a strength and a weakness, depending on the global context.
Okay, so they meet, they chat, they sip their fancy coffee. But what do they actually talk about? What are the big issues that land on the G7 agenda?
Think of it this way. If it's a major global challenge, it's probably on the G7's radar. Economic growth, trade, financial stability, global security threats, climate change, energy security, pandemics, you name it. The G7 aims to be a forum where the leaders of these powerful economies can coordinate their policies, share information, and try to find solutions to some of the world's most pressing problems.
But do they actually have any real power? It's not like they can pass laws or impose sanctions, right?
That's right. Their decisions aren't legally binding. But here's where things get really interesting. The G7 wields immense political influence. Think about it. These 7 countries collectively represent almost 50% of the global economy. When they speak, the world listens.
That makes sense. It's like a board of directors for the global economy, even if they don't have direct control over every aspect of it.
Yeah.
There's one big player missing from this boardroom, isn't there?
You're talking about Russia, right? They were part of the group back when it was the G8. But after the annexation of Crimea in 2014, they got kicked out. That move really highlighted the power dynamics within the G7. It showed that membership is not a given and that actions have consequences, even for major powers.
So it's a club with very high stakes.
Yeah.
And a membership that's not guaranteed.
Exactly. And the G7's relationship with Russia continues to be a complex and evolving one, especially given the current global situation. But let's not get ahead of ourselves. We'll circle back to Russia later in our deep dive.
Sounds good. For now, let's stick with who's in the club. Give us the rundown of the current G7 lineup.
All right, so the current members are Canada, France, Germany, Italy, Japan, the United Kingdom, and the United States. And we can't forget the president of the European Commission. They also get a seat at the table.
So it's not just countries,
Yeah.
but also supranational entities like the EU that have a voice in the G7. It's really about representing those major economic and political forces on the global stage.
Precisely. And each of these members brings their own unique perspective and priorities to the table. Canada, for instance, often champions issues related to climate change and sustainable development. Japan, on the other hand, is a major player in the technology and innovation sectors. It's this diversity of perspectives that can make the G7 such a powerful forum for addressing global challenges.
That's a great point. It's not a monolithic bloc. There's internal debate and negotiation, which I imagine can get pretty intense when you have such strong personalities and national interests at play.
Absolutely. And to manage all that complexity, there's a whole behind-the-scenes operation that most people don't even know about. We're talking about the
The
Sherpas.
Sherpas?
Yeah.
Like those who guide climbers up Mount Everest?
Well, not exactly the same Sherpas, but the analogy is apt. In the G7 context, Sherpas are personal representatives of each leader, and they're responsible for laying the groundwork for the main summit. Think of them as the ultimate diplomats, negotiators, and meeting planners, all rolled into one.
So they're the ones hammering out the details, drafting the agreements, and making sure that the world leaders don't accidentally end up in the wrong conference room.
Exactly. They work tirelessly behind the scenes, often for months leading up to the summit. To ensure that everything runs smoothly, their role is crucial, especially when you consider the sensitivities and complexities involved in coordinating the agendas of the world's most powerful nations.
It sounds like a high-pressure job, but I guess that's what it takes to keep the G7 machine running.
It certainly does, and while the Sherpas might not be in the spotlight, their work is essential for the success of the G7. Speaking of keeping things running smoothly, while the Sherpas work their diplomatic magic behind the scenes, there's another group we need to talk about that plays a significant role on the global stage, the G20.
Yeah, the G20. It always feels like whenever there's a big global economic crisis, the G20 gets called in to save the day.
That's a pretty accurate observation. The G20 emerged in 1999 when there was a growing realization that to really address global economic issues, you needed a broader perspective.
Makes sense. The G7 is exclusive, but the world is much bigger than just 7 countries.
Exactly. The G20 brings emerging economies like China, India, Brazil, and others to sit alongside those G7 heavyweights. It's a way to ensure that the voices of these rapidly growing economies are heard when it comes to shaping global economic policy.
So if the G7 is like the VIP section, the G20 is the main floor where everyone gets a seat.
That's a good way to put it. And this inclusivity is crucial because the decisions made by the G20 impact everyone. For those of you preparing for the UPSC, understanding the dynamics between the G7 and the G20 is key. It shows how global governance is evolving and how different groups of countries are trying to work together to address shared challenges.
It's like a multi-level chess game with economic power and political influence as the pieces. Speaking of power plays, let's rewind the clock a bit and talk about a recent G7 gathering, the 2019 summit hosted by France. That one had a lot of buzz around fighting inequality.
The 2019 summit was quite eventful. One of the big takeaways was Trump's push to bring Russia back into the fold. It sparked a lot of debate, especially considering the strained relationship between Russia and the West.
And that debate is still very relevant today,
Yeah,
especially with everything that's happening on the global stage.
absolutely. Another key issue at the 2019 summit was the U.S.-China trade war and its impact on the global economy. For anyone interested in international relations, this trade war is a prime example of how interconnected the world is. When two economic giants clash, the ripples are felt everywhere.
Yeah, that's a stark reminder
Yeah.
that in today's world, what happens in one country can have major consequences for the rest.
And then there was the presence of India as a special guest, invited by French President Macron.
India at the G7. That's interesting. Why were they there?
This invitation was a signal of India's growing economic influence and its increasing importance on the global stage. While not a formal member, India's presence at the summit highlighted its rising role in international affairs.
So even though India wasn't officially part of the G7, their presence spoke volumes about their growing clout.
It definitely did. And it leads us to another interesting development: Trump's proposal to reshape the G7 into a G11.
Ah, the G11. That was a big headline grabber. Tell us more about that.
Well, Trump proposed adding India, Russia, South Korea, and Australia to the group.
Interesting mix. But there's one glaring omission from that list, isn't there?
You notice that too. China is conspicuously absent from Trump's proposed G11. This move was seen by many as a strategic attempt to counter China's growing influence and solidify alliances with countries that share similar concerns.
So the G11 was essentially a power play, a way to reshape the global balance of power in favor of the U.S. and its allies.
That's one interpretation. But there are other perspectives too. Some argue that expanding the G7 to include more diverse voices is actually a good thing. It could make the group more representative of the current global landscape and potentially lead to more effective solutions to global problems.
It's definitely a complex issue, with valid arguments on both sides. But let's be real. Expanding the G7 also goes against the criticism that it's already too exclusive.
That's a great point, and that's one of the inherent tensions within the G7. On the one hand, There's a desire to be more inclusive and reflect the changing global order. On the other hand, there's the historical legacy of the G7 as an exclusive club of powerful nations.
It sounds like a balancing act. How do you reconcile those two competing forces?
That's the million-dollar question, and it's a question that the G7 continues to grapple with.
And all this talk about potential expansion raises another big question. Is the G7 even relevant anymore?
That's a question that comes up a lot, and it's a fair one. The G7 was created in a very different world. The Cold War was still raging, the global economy was less interconnected, and the balance of power was more straightforward. Today, we live in a multipolar world, with power more diffuse, and new challenges emerging all the time.
So is the G7 just a relic of the past? A dinosaur clinging to relevance in a rapidly changing world?
Not necessarily. While the G7 faces legitimate criticisms, it still holds significant weight on the global stage. It's a forum where leaders of major economies can come together, build relationships, and try to find common ground on critical issues, even if their decisions aren't legally binding. The political influence and soft power they wield can't be ignored.
Soft power. You mentioned that earlier. Can you elaborate on what that means in this context?
Soft power is the ability to influence others through persuasion, attraction, and cultural influence, rather than coercion or force. Think of it this way. A country's culture, its values, its ideas, these can all be sources of soft power.
So it's not just about military might or economic dominance, but also about the power of ideas and persuasion.
Exactly. And the G7 countries, with their strong economies, democratic values, and global cultural influence, have a lot of soft power. They can use this power to shape international norms, promote their interests, and build alliances, for instance. Think about how Hollywood movies or Silicon Valley innovations have spread American culture and values around the world. That's soft power in action.
That's a really interesting point. It's not always about brute force. Sometimes it's about winning hearts and minds.
Precisely. And that's something that the G7 has become increasingly aware of, especially as they face new challenges from rising powers like China.
So the G7 is adapting, trying to find new ways to leverage its influence in a changing world. But it's also facing a lot of internal criticism. We talked earlier about the argument that it's too exclusive. What are some of the other criticisms leveled at the G7?
One common criticism is that the G7 is too focused on the interests of developed nations and doesn't do enough to address the needs of developing countries. Critics argue that the G7's agenda is often skewed towards issues that are important to the wealthy, industrialized world, while neglecting issues like poverty, inequality, and climate change that disproportionately affect developing nations.
So it's a question of priorities.
Yeah.
And whose voices are being heard at the table.
Exactly. Another criticism is that the G7 is too slow to act and often fails to deliver on its promises. Critics point to issues like climate change, where the G7 has made ambitious commitments, but has struggled to translate those commitments into concrete action.
It's like making a grand gesture without following through.
That's one way to put it. And this lack of follow-through can damage the G7's credibility and undermine its ability to be a leader on the global stage.
So it seems like the G7 kind of stuck between a rock and a hard place, trying to maintain their position on the global stage, while also adapting to a world that's, well, becoming increasingly multipolar.
It's a tough spot to be in, and it raises some fundamental questions about the future of the G7. Can this group, with its roots in a bygone era, truly be a force for good in the 21st century?
That's the big question, isn't it? What does the future hold for the G7?
Well, there are a few possible scenarios. One possibility is that the G7 continues to evolve, becoming more inclusive, more responsive to global challenges, and more collaborative in its approach to global governance. This might involve expanding membership, reforming its decision-making processes, and taking a more active role in addressing issues like climate change and global inequality.
So kind of G7 2.0, a more modernized and inclusive version that's better suited to the realities of the 21st century.
Exactly. Another possibility is that the G7 gradually loses relevance as other groups, like the G20 or regional organizations, become more prominent on the global stage. In this scenario, the G7 might become more of a symbolic forum, a place for leaders to meet and discuss issues, but with less real power to shape global outcomes.
And then there's the possibility that the G7 fractures altogether, with internal divisions and disagreements leading to its eventual demise.
That's certainly a possibility, especially if the G7 fails to adapt to the changing global landscape and address the criticisms leveled against it.
So the future of the G7 is uncertain. It's at a crossroads, and its fate depends on the choices that its members make in the coming years.
Precisely. And those choices will have a profound impact on the shape of the global order.
Now, before we wrap up this deep dive, there's one more concept I want to touch on, something you mentioned earlier, the idea of a G0 world. What does that mean? And what are the implications for the G7?
The term G0 world refers to a scenario where no single country or group of countries has the power or the will to effectively lead the global community. It's a world where power is more diffuse, decision-making is more fragmented, and global cooperation is more difficult to achieve.
So a world without a clear leader. A world where the old rules no longer apply.
Exactly. And this is a world where the G7 faces perhaps its greatest challenge. In a G0 world, the G7's traditional approach to global governance, based on the assumption of its own leadership, becomes much less effective.
So the G7 has to find new ways to operate, new ways to exert influence, new ways to be relevant, in a world that's increasingly complex and unpredictable.
Absolutely. The G7 can no longer rely on its historical status or its economic power alone. It has to adapt, evolve, and find new ways to engage with a wider range of actors on the global stage.
It's a tall order, but a necessary one.
Yeah.
If the G7 wants to remain a force for good in the 21st century.
Indeed.
Well, we've covered a lot of ground today, from the origins of the G7 to its future prospects. For our listeners who are new to international relations, or those who are prepping for exams like the UPSC, the G7 is a microcosm of global power dynamics. Understanding how this group functions, its strengths, its weaknesses, and the challenges it faces can give you valuable insights into the complexities of the global system.
It's a fascinating case study for sure, and one that's constantly evolving.
That's right. And that's what makes it so important to stay informed, to keep learning, and to keep asking questions. Well, that brings us to the end of our deep dive into the G7. We hope you found this journey insightful and informative. And if you did, please don't forget to like this video, subscribe to our channel, and hit that bell icon to be notified of our next deep dive. Until then, keep exploring, keep learning, and keep questioning.
We'll see you next time.